They said the city of Chicago had seen greatness before. They said they'd seen impossible already. They said no one should even try to stand in the shadow Michael Jordan left behind. But on the south side of Chicago, in a place where hope was rationed and dreams expired early, a quiet kid wasn't listening. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy with his words. He didn't talk about legacy. He didn't promise championships. He just played. And every time Derrick Rose touched the basketball, it felt like the concrete courts of Chicago were breathing again. This story doesn't begin with trophies or MVP chants. It begins with hunger. The kind of hunger that doesn't care about odds. The kind of hunger that comes from knowing if you fail, there's nothing to fall back on. Derrick Rose grew up where survival came before ambition. Englewood wasn't a place that protected dreams. It tested them. Sirens were background noise. Violence was normal. And expectations were low. Most kids were told what they couldn't belong before they ever discovered what they could be. But Derrick was different, not because he talked big, but because he listened. He listened to the bounce of the ball. He listened to the rhythm of the game. Basketball wasn't an escape for him. It was a language, a way to speak without saying anything. On those cracked courts, he learned something early. Speed could be mercy, and hesitation could be fatal. He learned to explode, to change direction, to float in the air just long enough to make defenders look helpless. Long before the NBA knew his name, Chicago knew something special was growing quietly in its shadows. By the time he reached high school, the whispers had started. Not media hype, real whispers. Coaches, old heads, street legends. That kid is different. Derrick Rose at Simeon Career Academy wasn't just winning games. He was dismantling defenses. He moved like he was late for something important. His first step didn't just beat defenders. It embarrassed them. And yet, even as the city watched him rise, Derrick stayed silent. No chest pounding. No trash talk. Just relentless motion. He carried his team, his neighborhood, his family, and a city starving for hope. Every basket felt like a promise. Maybe we're not done yet. College was supposed to be a pit stop. 1 year at Memphis. 1 season to prove what everyone already believed. And he did. He carried Memphis to the NCAA championship game as a freshman, standing toe-to-toe with veterans, playing with the calm of someone who had already survived worse than pressure. Though the title slipped away, something else was secured that night. The NBA wasn't a dream anymore. It was a destination. And when draft night came, fate leaned in. Chicago had the #1 pick. The hometown kid. The prodigal son. The city that once lost its basketball identity now held its breath. When the commissioner called Derrick Rose's name, it wasn't just a draft selection. It was a resurrection. Jerseys sold out overnight. Headlines screamed hope. Fans didn't ask if he could be great. They asked how soon. And Derrick, still quiet, still reserved, simply put on the jersey and went away. From his first NBA games, it was clear this wasn't normal. He was faster than defenders who trained their whole lives to stop players like him. He attacked the rim like gravity was optional. He didn't avoid contact. He absorbed it. Every night felt electric. The United sent a buzz again. Chicago believed again. And Derrick Rose didn't just meet expectations. He crushed them. Rookie of the Year, All-Star, franchise cornerstone. The city had found its heartbeat. Then came the season that changed everything. 2010 to 2011. Derrick Rose wasn't just good. He was unstoppable. At just 22 years old, he led the Bulls to the best record in the NBA. Night after night, he carried the offense, bailed out broken plays, and hit impossible shots in impossible moments. Defenses knew what was coming, and it didn't matter. He was faster than traps, stronger than contact, smarter than schemes. And when the MVP was announced, history bowed. Youngest MVP ever. Chicago roared. The league watched. A new king was rising. But here's the part no highlight reel prepares you for. Success doesn't warn you before it turns. At the peak of your powers, when the world finally agrees you're special, fate sometimes decides to test whether you were built for more than applause. The playoffs arrived. Expectations were sky high. Championship dreams felt close enough to touch. And then, in a moment that lasted less than a second, everything changed. Game 1, first round, late in the fourth quarter. A simple play. Derrick Rose drives, plants his left foot, and jumps. There's no dramatic collision, no violent fall, just a sudden, unnatural collapse. He hits the floor holding his knee. The arena goes silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that feels wrong. The kind that tells you something sacred just broke. Derek tries to stand. He can't. Teammates surround him. Fans pray. And deep down, everyone knows. This isn't a tweak. This isn't minor. The diagnosis hits like a sentence. Torn ACL. Season over. Championship hopes dead. The league moves on. And the MVP, the youngest ever, is suddenly alone with pain no trophy can heal. In one moment, Derrick Rose went from the face of the future to a question mark. From unstoppable to uncertain. From hope to heartbreak. But here's where the Real story begins. Because talent can take you to the top. But it's what you do after the fall that decides who you really are. Derrick Rose didn't scream. He didn't curse the world. He didn't make excuses. He disappeared. Rehab rooms replaced arenas. Silence replaced cheers. And while fans argued about whether he'd ever be the same, Derrick Rose was fighting a war no one could see. What the world didn't know yet was this, that injury didn't just damage his knee. It attacked his identity. It forced him to ask a question most champions never want to face. Who are you when the thing you do best is taken from you? And the answer to that question wouldn't come quickly. It wouldn't come easily. And it wouldn't come without more pain. Because the fall wasn't finished yet. Just when Derrick Rose thought surviving the first injury was the hardest battle he'd ever face, the game wasn't done with him. And the next setback would test not just his body, but his will to keep believing at all. Rehab doesn't feel heroic. There are no cameras, no crowds, no chants, just cold rooms, stiff joints, endless repetitions, and a quiet voice in your head asking questions you don't want to answer. Derrick Rose went from being the fastest man on the court to learning how to walk, bend, and trust his body again. Day after day, he showed up while the world slowly forgot. Highlights kept playing without him. The league crowned new stars. Fans debated his future like he was already gone. And Derrick said nothing. He never begged for sympathy. He never rushed the process for applause. He stayed silent because silence was the only place he could fight without distractions. Every rep hurt. Not just physically, but mentally. The ACL injury didn't just steal time, it stole confidence. Explosiveness is a promise between your mind and your body. When you think go, your body must obey instantly. After the injury, that promise was broken. Derrick's knee had betrayed him once, and trust doesn't come back just because doctors say you're cleared. Still, he worked, he trained, he rebuilt muscle, balance, and movement. He studied film. He imagined the moment he'd step back onto the floor. And through it all, he carried a weight heavier than any barbell, the fear of never being himself again. The 2012 to 2013 season arrived, and Chicago waited, not impatiently. Hopefully, fans didn't demand dominance. They just wanted to see him run again. But Derrick didn't return. Game after game passed. Not ready, he said, and the noise started. Analysts questioned his heart. Commentators whispered words no athlete ever wants attached to their name. Scared, soft, hesitant. People who had never torn a ligament or felt any give out under their own weight suddenly had opinions. If he's healthy, why isn't he playing? They asked. What they didn't understand was that health on paper isn't the same as readiness in the soul. Derrick heard everything. He just chose not to answer, because rushing back for approval would have cost him something more valuable than a season. It would have cost him his future. So he waited. He endured the criticism. He watched his teammates fight without him. And when the Bulls were eliminated, the blame didn't go to the roster or the injuries. It landed squarely on Derrick Rose's silence. Still, he didn't fire back. He stayed in the gym. Finally, in the fall of 2013, he returned. The city erupted. It felt like resurrection. Every step he took was celebrated. Every drive to the basket felt like a small miracle. He wasn't exactly the same, but he was close enough to believe, close enough to hope, close enough to dream again. And then, just as confidence began to settle back into his bones, the nightmare returned. November 22nd, 2013. Portland. A routine play. Derrick attacks the rim, lands awkwardly, and immediately grabs his knee. This time, it's the other one. Another ACL tear. Another season gone. Another year erased in seconds. The arena fell silent again, but this time, it felt heavier. Like deja vu that no one asked for. Derek lay on the floor staring at the ceiling, not in shock, but in disbelief. How does the same nightmare happen twice? How do you convince yourself to stand up again when the ground keeps pulling you back? This injury broke something deeper. Not just ligaments. Faith. Hope. The belief that hard work guarantees famous. Because here was a player who did everything right. He waited. He trained. He listened. And still, the game punished him again. Surgery stacked up. Rehab restarted. And the world's tone changed. No more when he comes back. Now it was if he comes back. The MVP label started to feel like a cruel joke from another lifetime. Rehab the second time was lonelier. The cameras were gone. The excitement had faded. Derrick Rose became a cautionary tale instead of a comeback story. People stopped asking how soon he'd return and started predicting how fast he'd fade. Some fans moved on. Some media members closed the book on his career entirely. And Derrick, once again, said nothing. Because what do you say when words won't change the reality you're trapped in? He trained in isolation. Early mornings, late nights, no spotlight, just pain, repetition, and memory. Memory of who he used to be. Memory of flying above defenders. Memory of a body that responded instantly to thought. And now, every step came with doubt. Could it happen again? Would his knees ever hold? Was it worth continuing? These weren't dramatic questions. They were quiet, exhausting ones that visited him every night. When he returned again, the league had changed. Faster pace, new stars, different expectations. Derrick Rose was no longer the future. He was a risk, a gamble, a what if. He played carefully, sometimes too carefully. The explosiveness that once terrified defenses now came in flashes instead of waves. And then, as if the universe wanted to be absolutely certain he was tested beyond reason, more injuries followed. Meniscus tears, surgeries, missed games. Every attempt to build momentum was interrupted. Every small victory was followed by another setback. Fans grew frustrated. Coaches grew cautious. The Bulls, once built entirely around him, began to move on. Trades were discussed. Roles shrank. And eventually, the city that once crowned him quietly let him go. Derrick Rose was traded away from Chicago, from home, from the place where his dreams first took shape. No ceremony, no fairy tale ending, just a transaction. Now imagine that moment. Leaving the city that raised you, the city that believed in you, the city that once chanted your name like a prayer. And leaving not as a champion, but as a question mark. Derrick Rose had lost the league's belief. But worse, he was close to losing his own. New teams brought new starts, but the doubts followed him everywhere. Coaches limited his minutes. Fans wondered if he was washed. Analysts labeled him fragile. And every time he stepped on the court, the fear lingered. Not fear of defenders, fear of himself. Fear of planting wrong. Fear of jumping too hard. Fear that the next play could be the last one again. There were nights he sat alone in locker rooms long after games ended. Nights he questioned whether continuing was worth the pain, the rehab, the disappointment. He had money. He had accomplishments. He had every reason to walk away. And that's what made the choice so heavy. Because walking away would have been easy. Staying meant accepting a new identity. One without guarantees. One without applause. What people didn't realize was that Derrick Rose was changing. Not physically. Mentally, the player who once relied purely on speed was being forced to learn patience. The man who attacked without thinking now had to think before every move. And while the world saw decline, something else was quietly forming beneath the surface. A different kind of strength. A humility forged in loss. A resilience built not on dominance, but survival. But just when it seemed like Derrick Rose was destined to fade into the background of NBA history, when his name was spoken only in past tense, when even believers were running out of faith, something unexpected happened. Something no one predicted. Something that would remind the world that greatness doesn't always rule. Sometimes it waits. Derrick Rose was about to reach a point where quitting felt logical and continuing felt impossible. And yet, In the darkest moment of his career, when no one was watching anymore, he was about to shock the world in a way that silence never could. By the time Derrick Rose arrived in Minnesota, expectations had disappeared, not lowered, erased. He wasn't introduced as a savior or franchise cornerstone. He was introduced as depth, insurance, a former MVP whose best days were spoken of in past tense. The league had already decided who he was now, a role player with a fragile body and a beautiful memory. No pressure, no spotlight, and strangely, that was the first time in years Derrick Rose could finally breathe. He didn't come to Minnesota chasing headlines. He came chasing peace. A place where he could play without carrying a city's hope on his back. A place where mistakes wouldn't become debates. Practices were quieter. Media questions were shorter. And for the first time since the injury began, Derrick Rose wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He just wanted to play basketball again. Not as an MVP. Not as a symbol. Just as himself. Still, the doubts followed him. Coaches watched his minutes carefully. Teammates respected him but didn't rely on him. Fans remembered the highlights but didn't expect them. Every drive to the rim was met with held breath, waiting for his knee to betray him again. And Derrick felt it too. The fear never fully left. It simply learned how to coexist with hope. He adjusted his game. Fewer reckless attacks. More floaters. Smarter angles. He learned how to survive instead of dominate. Then came October 31st, 2018. A random regular season night. No national spotlight. No storyline. Just Minnesota versus Utah. Derrick Rose wasn't even supposed to play heavy minutes. But something felt different. From the opening tip, his movements were fluid. His steps were confident. The ball obeyed him again. He drove without hesitation. He finished through contact. He pulled up without doubt. Possession after possession, something ancient began to wake up. By halftime, teammates noticed. By the third quarter, defenders noticed. By the fourth quarter, the entire arena felt it. This wasn't nostalgia. This wasn't luck. This was memory reasserting itself. Derrick Rose wasn't playing scared. He wasn't calculating. He was flowing. And when the game tightened, when Minnesota needed buckets, the ball found him. Over and over again. Shot after shot fell. Drive sliced through defenders. And with every basket, years of doubt cracked. The crowd rose to its feet not because they were witnessing a great performance, but because they were witnessing resurrection. 30 points. 40. And still he wasn't done. He attacked the rim with a familiarity that felt impossible. When the final buzzer sounded, the scoreboard read 50. 50 points. Not from the youngest MVP. Not from the future of the league, but from the man everyone had already given up on. Derrick Rose stood at midcourt, hands on his knees, eyes full. Teammates surrounded him. Fans screamed. And for the first time in years, Derrick couldn't hold it in. Tears came. Not of joy, of release. Years of frustration, doubt, pain, and silence poured out in that moment. Because that night wasn't about scoring 50 points. It was about proving to himself that he was still alive. But here's the part most people missed. That game didn't erase the injuries. It didn't restore his youth. It didn't guarantee a happy ending. It simply reminded the world of something deeper, that persistence doesn't need permission, that greatness doesn't vanish just because the spotlight moves on, that sometimes the loudest statement is made when no one expects you to speak. After that night, the narrative shifted. Slowly, cautiously, teams looked at Derrick Rose differently. Not as a savior, but as something equally valuable. Survivor, someone who knew how to endure. Someone who understood the cost of every minute on the floor. He wasn't chasing MVPs anymore. He was chasing meaning. And that made him dangerous in a new way. Opportunities followed. Short-term contracts. Limited roles. But Derrick Rose embraced them. Six-man. Veteran presence. Score off the bench. He played with gratitude instead of entitlement. With patience instead of force. And while his body still whispered warnings, his mind had learned how to listen without surrendering. Every game played became a victory in itself. Yet, even after the 50-point night, the fight wasn't over. Because one great performance doesn't rewrite a career. Doubters still existed. Injuries still lingered. And the question still hung in the air. Was this just one last flash, or was there more left in him? Derrick Rose didn't answer with words. He answered with consistency. Night after night, he showed up. Some games were quiet. Some were strong. Some were limited by pain. But he kept showing up, and that, more than any stat line, redefined him. He had become proof that resilience isn't about bouncing back to who you were. It's about evolving into who you need to be. There were moments he considered walking away. He admitted it later. Moments when the pain outweighed the joy. Moments when the memory of who he used to be felt heavier than the reality of who he was now. But something kept him going. Not ego, not money, purpose. The understanding that his story was bigger than basketball. That somewhere, someone was watching him fight through doubt and finding the strength to keep going too. The league eventually respected him again. Not with MVP chants, but with trust. Coaches trusted him in big moments. Teammates trusted him in close games. And fans, especially those who had followed his fall, began to see him differently. Derrick Rose wasn't a tragedy. He was a lesson that said, falling doesn't disqualify you. Being broken doesn't erase your worth. And silence doesn't mean surrender. But as powerful as that 50-point night was, it wasn't the final chapter. Because legacy isn't defined by a single game. It's defined by what you choose to stand for when the applause fades again. And for Derrick Rose, the most important transformation was still unfolding. Not on the court, but within. Derrick Rose had reminded the world of his greatness, but now he faced a harder challenge, accepting a new version of himself without resentment, without regret, and without letting the past destroy the future. The hardest battles don't happen under bright lights. They happen in quiet moments, when the noise is gone and you're left alone with your thoughts. For Derrick Rose, the loudest opponent he ever faced wasn't a defender, an injury, or even doubt from the outside world. It was memory. Memory of who he used to be. Memory of how easy the game once felt. Memory of a body that answered instantly when his mind commanded it to move. And learning to live with that memory without letting it poison the present became the most difficult challenge of his life. After the 50-point night in Minnesota, people assumed everything had changed. They thought confidence returned permanently. They thought the fear disappeared. They thought the story had reached its happy ending. But that's not how healing works. That night didn't remove the pain. It didn't erase the caution. It didn't bring back youth. What it did was something more subtle and more powerful. It gave Derrick Rose permission to let go of who he was and accept who he had become. He stopped chasing ghosts. The explosive, fearless MVP version of himself still existed in memory, but Derrick no longer demanded that version show up every night. He learned to respect his body instead of fighting it, to choose moments instead of forcing them, to play with intelligence rather than desperation. And in that shift, something unexpected happened. He found peace. Teams began to value him differently, not as a franchise savior, but as a stabilizer, a calming presence, a player who had seen the highest highs and the lowest lows and survived both. In locker rooms, younger players listened when Derrick Rose spoke, not because he talked loudly, but because his scars spoke for him. He didn't preach. He didn't boast. He simply existed as proof that you could lose almost everything and still find meaning. There were nights when his body cooperated and nights when it didn't. Nights when he looked ageless and nights when pain limited him. But his mindset didn't waver. He stopped measuring success by numbers. Minutes played became victories. Finishing games became triumphs. And each season he stayed in the league felt like defiance against every timeline that said he should have been gone already. Away from basketball, Derrick changed too. The anger faded. The frustration softened. He stopped needing validation from fans, analysts, or even history. He began to understand that being great once was rare, but continuing to show up after being broken was rarer. His identity expanded. He was no longer just an MVP. He was a father, a mentor, a survivor, someone who could sit with pain without letting it define him. There were still hard days, days when his knees ached before sunrise, days when rehab never truly ended, days when he questioned whether the sacrifices were worth it. But the difference now was clarity. Derrick Rose wasn't running from the past or chasing it. He was walking forward with it. And that made all the difference. Fans began to see him through a new lens. Not as a star who never fully returned, but as a man who never quit. as someone whose career wasn't a straight line upward, but a brutal zigzag that tested every ounce of resilience. His story became bigger than basketball. It became something people could carry into their own lives. Because not everyone will be an MVP, but everyone will face loss, injury, disappointment, a version of themselves they can never get back. Derrick Rose showed that you don't have to erase the past to move forward. You just have to stop letting it control you. Late in his career, he embraced roles that once might have bruised his ego. Coming off the bench, limited minutes, short-term deals, and he did it with gratitude instead of resentment. Every game was a gift. Every opportunity a reminder that he was still here, still competing, still defying the narrative that said his story ended years ago. And here's the quiet truth. Derrick Rose didn't find peace because the pain ended. He found peace because he stopped fighting reality. He accepted that greatness could look different now. That impact didn't always mean dominance. Sometimes it meant presence, guidance, example. Yet even in peace, there was still fire, a controlled burn, a refusal to let go completely. He still prepared like someone who respected the game, still trained like someone who understood how easily it could all be taken away. And when his number was called, he answered, not to prove anything, but because playing was still his way of honoring everything he'd survived. But legacy isn't fully written until the final page. And Derrick Rose's story wasn't just about how he played after the injuries. It was about what his journey meant to the people watching, to the ones who had been broken and told they were finished, to the ones quietly rebuilding without applause, to the ones still searching for a reason not to give up. The final chapter wouldn't be about stats or awards. It would be about meaning, about what it truly means to refuse to stay down, and how a man who once flew above the rim learned that staying on your feet after falling can be its own kind of greatness. Derrick Rose had made peace with the pain, but his story was about to leave the court and enter something bigger, a legacy that would speak to anyone who's ever been told their best days are behind them. Most stories end when the noise fades, when the crowd stops chanting, when the jersey comes off for the last time. But Derrick Rose's story was never meant to end with a buzzer, because some legacies aren't built on how high you rise. They are built on how often you get back up when staying down would have made sense. By the time Derrick Rose reached the later years of his career, the league barely resembled the one he entered. New stars ruled. New styles dominated. The pace was faster, the spacing wider, the conversations louder. And yet, Derrick Rose still walked into arenas with something few others possessed: perspective. He knew how quickly everything could disappear. He knew what it felt like to lose a game you loved while still being alive to remember it. And that knowledge shaped everything he did. He no longer chased validation. The MVP trophy already existed. The banners and records already had their place in history. What mattered now was presence. Showing up, competing honestly, leaving the game better than he found it, not by domination, but by example. Younger players watched how he moved, how he spoke, how he handled frustration. They didn't see bitterness. They saw balance. They saw someone who had lost nearly everything and still chose gratitude. There were nights when his body wouldn't cooperate, nights when minutes were limited, nights when he barely touched the floor. And instead of resentment, there was acceptance. Because Derrick Rose understood something most never learned. Your value doesn't disappear just because your role changes. And that realization freed him in a way youth never could. Away from the court, his voice began to carry more weight. Not because he talked more, but because when he did speak, it came from truth. He spoke openly about mental health, about fear, about the loneliness of recovery. He admitted that there were moments he didn't know if he could keep going. And in doing so, he gave permission to countless others to admit the same. His honesty became a bridge between athletes and fans, between strength and vulnerability. Derrick Rose's legacy slowly shifted from what he did to what he represented. He became proof that pain doesn't cancel purpose, that being broken doesn't make you finished, that your story isn't over just because it doesn't look like what you imagined. For people watching from hospital beds, from dead-end jobs, from moments of private despair, his journey became a mirror, a reminder that continuing, even quietly, is an act of courage. He never reclaimed the throne he once sat on. And that's okay, because the throne was never the point. The point was survival with dignity. The point was choosing effort over bitterness. The point was refusing to let tragedy turn into identity. Derrick Rose didn't win by returning to MVP form. He won by redefining what winning meant. Think about that for a moment. At 22, he reached the peak most athletes dream of their entire lives. And yet, the most meaningful part of his career came after the fall. After the surgeries, after the silence, after the world moved on. That's not just a basketball lesson. That's a life lesson. Because everyone has a version of themselves they miss. A season when things worked. A time when effort was rewarded. A moment when the future felt certain. And like Derrick Rose, most people don't lose that version slowly. They lose it suddenly. Through injury, failure, loss, betrayal. One moment you're flying. The next, you're on the floor wondering how you'll ever stand again. Derrick Rose teaches us that standing up doesn't mean being the same. It means being willing to continue as someone new. His career became a quiet rebellion against despair, against timelines that said he should have quit, against narratives that reduced him to what could have been. He showed that what could have been doesn't have to be an ending. It can be the beginning of something deeper, something truer, something earned through pain instead of gifted by talent. When Derrick Rose eventually walked away from the game, he didn't do it as a failure. He did it as a man who had given everything he had, not just his best years, but his hardest ones too. And that's why his story lasts. Because rings fade, records break, but resilience leaves fingerprints on everyone who witnesses it. So if you're watching this feeling like your best days are behind you, hear this clearly. Your story is not over. If Derrick Rose could lose his body, his speed, his status, and still find meaning, then your setback is not a sentence. It's a chapter, and chapters can be rewritten. You don't need to return as who you were. You just need to refuse to stay down. Because the world doesn't remember Derrick Rose only as the youngest MVP in NBA history. It remembers him as a man who fell, the man who broke, the man who was counted out, and still stood up. Greatness isn't always loud. Comebacks aren't always fast. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is keep going when no one is clapping.